Hello, everyone. This is the narration for the second half of the Chapter 6 PowerPoint slides. If everything went well in class, I would have covered the first part, but if not, you should see instructions on Canvas or an announcement or an email for what you should be doing instead. So in the first half of the PowerPoint slides, we would have talked about the alternative versus the null hypothesis. We would have talked about how there are differences, and how there are often differences between means, and we don't know whether those differences are due to sampling error or whether it's a real difference where something is causing them. So what we're going to talk about in this part of the PowerPoint slides is how we tell. In other words, how do we determine whether we accept the alternative hypothesis and conclude that the difference is real, or whether we accept the null hypothesis? Okay. So there are two main methods using inferential statistics to determine whether we accept the alternative or the null hypothesis. In the first method, an obtained value is compared to a critical value. Let's define these terms. The obtained value is the size of the relationship determined by the inferential statistical test. So this is the method that we're going to use when we do statistics by hand, for example, from the book or during our class time. When we conduct an inferential statistical test and calculate it by hand, what we're going to find is the obtained value. So next week, we're going to go over the z-test in class, and I'm going to show you all how to calculate z obtained. So again, when you perform the math, run the statistical test, you're going to calculate the obtained value. The critical value is the cutoff for accepting the alternative hypothesis determined ahead of time. We're going to determine the critical value in a different way than actually conducting a test, but basically, given the parameters of our study, we would be able to figure out the critical value. So again, to go through this one more time, we determine the obtained value by conducting the statistical test, and we determine the critical value based on other parameters in the study. How do we know then whether to accept the alternative or the null hypothesis? Well, the alternative hypothesis is accepted if the obtained value is more extreme than the critical value. Otherwise, the null hypothesis is accepted. Over the next couple of weeks, you'll see what I mean by more extreme. But for our purposes today, it's probably good enough just to use the word larger instead. So it's pretty simple. The alternative hypothesis is accepted if the obtained value is larger than the critical value. Otherwise, the null hypothesis is accepted. So for example, if we conduct a z-test and we find that the obtained value is 2.71, and we determine through other means that the critical value is 1.96, well, 2.71 is larger than 1.96, and so we would accept the alternative hypothesis. If instead the obtained value was like 0.51, then we would accept the null hypothesis because that obtained value, 0.51, would be less than the critical value, causing us to accept the null hypothesis. The other main method of doing inferential statistical tests is by comparing the p-value to the alpha level. This is the method that we're going to use when we use SPSS. So when we run SPSS, we enter in our numbers, we select the correct test, we have SPSS run the test for us. SPSS is going to tell us both the obtained value of the test, and it's going to tell us the p-value. We will then be able to compare the p-value to the alpha level. Okay, so the p-value is the actual probability of obtaining a relationship of a given size or larger due to chance determined by the inferential statistical test. So the p-value is going to be a number between 0 and 1, telling you, the probability that you would find this relationship just due to chance. Again, we determine the p-value by conducting the inferential statistical test. When we do the tests by hand, we're not going to calculate the p-value, but SPSS will provide it for us when we do inferential statistics through it. The alpha level is the cutoff for accepting the alternative hypothesis chosen ahead of time, usually 0.05. The alpha level could vary from study to study. However, in this course, we are only going to use an alpha level of 0.05. Again, and that's because in psychology, 99% of the time, that's what the alpha level will be. Every once in a while, you might see an alpha level of 0.01 in psychology or like 0.001. But again, The vast majority of the time, the alpha level is going to be 0.01. How do we determine then whether to accept the alternative or the null hypothesis? Again, it's fairly straightforward. The alternative hypothesis is accepted if the p-value is less than the alpha level. That is, if p is less than 0.05. Otherwise, the null hypothesis is accepted. Again, pretty simple. If your p-value is less than the alpha level, which for us is going to be 0.05, you accept the alternative hypothesis. So again, alpha level, always 0.05. If the p-value is 0.02, accept the alternative hypothesis. If SPSS tells you that the p-value is 0.008, accept the alternative hypothesis. If SPSS tells you that the p-value is 0.3 or that the p-value is 0.71, then you would accept the null hypothesis, because in these last two cases, the p-value would be greater than 0.05. So again, one more time, if the p-value is less than 0.05, you would accept the alternative hypothesis. Otherwise, if it's greater than 0.05, accept the null hypothesis. So overall, if the alternative hypothesis is accepted, these things are true. First, the null hypothesis is rejected. Remember, for any study, we're either going to accept the alternative or the null hypothesis and reject the other. So if we accept the alternative hypothesis, by definition, we're going to reject the null hypothesis. It means that the p-value is less than the alpha level. We talked about this on the previous slide. If the p-value is less than the alpha level, that means you accept the alternative hypothesis. So again, the same thing is true the other way around. If we know that we've accepted the alternative hypothesis, that means that our p-value must have been less than the alpha level of 0.05. If you accept the alternative hypothesis, that means the obtained value is larger than the critical value. That's what we discussed a couple slides ago. That again, by definition, if your obtained value from calculating a statistical test is larger than the critical value, then you accept the alternative hypothesis. If you accept the alternative hypothesis, that means the relationship is statistically significant. You'll hear me use this term from time to time, statistically significant. That's just another way of saying that the alternative hypothesis is accepted. And then we're not going to talk about this in class, but it is mentioned in the textbook. So just for clarity's sake, if the alternative hypothesis is accepted, it means the obtained value falls in the region of rejection. Again, feel free to read the textbook to get more information, but if you ever hear this term, again, the obtained value falling in the region of rejection, just another way of describing a scenario where the alternative hypothesis is accepted. Now, what I want to highlight on this slide is that all of these statements mean the same thing, and I will be using them interchangeably. If I say the null hypothesis is rejected, you should just come to know, oh, well, that means we accept the alternative hypothesis. If I tell you that the relationship is statistically significant, you should say, oh, well, yeah, that just means the alternative hypothesis is accepted. Don't expect you to know all of this information at once, but again, over the next couple of weeks, just get used to all of these terms meaning the same thing. And finally, I just want to do a quick summary of the inferential procedure. If you understood nothing from this entire week of class, if the information on this slide makes sense to you, or if you think, okay, I'll be able to get this over the next week or two, then we're still in great shape. Okay, so how do you do inferential statistics? Well, there are two main ways. You can either A, calculate the obtained value and compare it to the critical value, or you can calculate the p-value and compare it to the alpha level of 0.05. You would accept the alternative hypothesis if the obtained value is larger than the critical value, or if the p-value is less than 0.05. Notice that if we accept the alternative hypothesis, this also means that we reject the null hypothesis and that the results are statistically significant. The other possibility is that we would accept the null hypothesis. And we would accept the null hypothesis if the obtained value is smaller than the critical value, or if the p-value is greater than 0.05. If we accept the null hypothesis, it also means that the alternative hypothesis is rejected and that the results are not statistically significant. All right, that's it for me for this video.